At 3:15 on the afternoon of January 18, 1945, Captain Thomas Brennan pressed his back against the frozen stone wall of a Belgian farmhouse, while German voices shouted orders less than 50 yards away. Snow fell in thick curtains across the Ardennes forest, muffling sound and obscuring vision. Brennan's right hand rested on the grip of his Browning baby, .25 caliber pistol, a weapon so small it fit in his coat pocket, so underpowered that his fellow officers had openly mocked it as a lady's purse gun, a toy that belonged in a detective novel rather than on a battlefield where men carried M1 Garands and Thompson submachine guns. If you're fascinated by the most unconventional warriors of World War II, hit that like button and subscribe. This is the story of a man who proved that the deadliest weapon in war is not always the one that fires the most bullets, but the mind that knows when not to fire at all. Thomas Brennan was born in 1916 in Philadelphia, the son of an Irish immigrant police detective who worked the toughest precincts of South Philadelphia. His father, Patrick Brennan, was a man who understood human nature in its rawest forms: the desperation of criminals, the psychology of interrogation, the art of reading a suspect's eyes to know when he was lying or telling the truth, or balanced on the edge of breaking. Young Thomas spent his childhood listening to his father's stories over dinner, tales of how a well-placed question could do more than a fist, how silence could be more intimidating than shouting, how knowing what a man feared could give you control over him without ever raising your voice. Patrick Brennan carried a snub-nose .38 revolver, but he liked to say that in 20 years on the force, his real weapon had been his ability to make a man believe that cooperation was his only option. Thomas inherited his father's analytical mind and his fascination with human psychology. He excelled in school, particularly in languages and debate, and won a scholarship to the University of Pennsylvania, where he studied psychology and criminology. His professors noted his unusual ability to read people, to sense their vulnerabilities, and leverage them in argument. He was not physically imposing, 5 feet 10 inches tall, lean build, with sharp features and observant gray eyes, but he had a presence that made people pay attention when he spoke. In 1938, he graduated with honors and considered following his father into police work. Then Hitler invaded Poland, and the world caught fire. Brennan enlisted in the United States Army in December 1941, days after Pearl Harbor. His education and psychological acumen quickly caught the attention of Army intelligence, and after completing officer candidate school, he was assigned to the 2nd Infantry Division's G2 section, military intelligence. His job was interrogation of prisoners, analysis of enemy movements, and psychological operations. He proved exceptionally good at it. Where other interrogators relied on intimidation or prolonged questioning, Brennan had a gift for finding the psychological pressure point, the thing a captured German soldier feared most, whether it was being sent to a Soviet POW camp, being labeled a coward by his own side, or simply the terror of continued combat. He used these fears not cruelly, but surgically, extracting information with an efficiency that impressed his superiors and disturbed some of his colleagues. It was during his training at Fort Ritchie, Maryland, the Army's intelligence school, that Brennan acquired his infamous Browning baby pistol. The weapon was a Belgian-made .25 caliber semi-automatic, barely 5 inches long, weighing less than 10 ounces. It held 6 rounds of ammunition so small that they looked like they belonged in a child's cap gun. Standard issue for American officers was the M1911, .45 caliber pistol, a hand cannon that could stop a man with a single shot. But Brennan had studied the ballistics, the weight, the practicality. The .45 was heavy, bulky, and in his role as an intelligence officer, he rarely expected to be in direct firefights. What he needed was something he could carry everywhere without it weighing him down, something concealable, something that would serve not as his primary weapon, but as a psychological tool. The Browning baby fit in his coat pocket. It was always with him, and its very smallness, he believed, could be turned to advantage in the right circumstances. When he first showed the pistol to his fellow officers, the reaction was immediate and brutal. Major Robert Hendricks, the division's operations officer, picked it up and laughed out loud. "Brennan, what the hell is this? A toy? You planning to fight the Germans with a pea shooter?" Captain Frank Delaney, a combat veteran who had fought in North Africa and Sicily, shook his head in disgust. "That thing wouldn't stop a determined rabbit. You're gonna get yourself killed." Even the enlisted men in his section made jokes. They called it the pocket pistol, the lady's gun, the toy. Brennan took the mockery without comment. He knew what they saw, a small, inadequate weapon in a war of rifles, machine guns, artillery, and tanks. But he also knew something they did not. The weapon itself was almost irrelevant. What mattered was the situation in which you used it, and the story you could make others believe. By the winter of 1944, the 2nd Infantry Division had been fighting its way through France and into Belgium for months. The men were exhausted, cold, and battered by continuous combat. Then, in mid-December, the Germans launched their last great offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler had gambled everything on a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes forest, hoping to split the Allied armies and recapture the vital port of Antwerp. The offensive caught the Americans off guard. Entire divisions were surrounded. Green troops panicked and fled. The German advance punched a huge bulge into the American lines, and for days, the outcome hung in the balance. The 2nd Infantry Division was thrown into the desperate fighting around the town of Elsenborn Ridge, where American forces struggled to hold against waves of German panzer divisions and elite Wehrmacht infantry. Brennan's role shifted from interrogation to tactical intelligence. He and small reconnaissance teams would slip behind German lines, observe enemy movements, capture prisoners when possible, and report back. It was dangerous work. The winter of 1944-45 was one of the coldest on record. Temperatures dropped below 0 Fahrenheit. Snow piled in drifts that reached a man's waist. Frostbite claimed as many casualties as German bullets. Soldiers wrapped their feet in newspaper inside their boots to keep from losing toes. Equipment froze, weapons jammed. Men died from exposure in foxholes, their bodies found days later frozen solid. On January 17, 1945, Brennan was ordered to lead a reconnaissance patrol deep into German-held territory, east of the Elsenborn Ridge. His mission was to locate a suspected German artillery position that had been shelling American positions with devastating accuracy. He took 4 men with him: Sergeant Bill Crawford, a tough Kentuckian who had survived Omaha Beach; Corporal Eddie Kowalski, a radio operator from Detroit; Private First Class James Riley, a quiet farm boy from Iowa who served as their medic; and Private Sam Tucker, a 19-year-old rifleman from Texas who had joined the division only 3 weeks earlier and was still terrified every moment of every day. They moved out before dawn, slipping through the frozen forest in the gray half-light, their boots crunching on the snow no matter how carefully they stepped. They found the artillery position by mid-morning. A battery of 4 German 105mm howitzers dug into a clearing, protected by log bunkers and camouflage netting. Brennan counted approximately 30 German soldiers, enough to make a direct assault suicidal. He radioed the coordinates back to division headquarters and prepared to withdraw. That was when everything went wrong. A German patrol, a full platoon of perhaps 40 men, was moving through the same sector, sweeping for American scouts. The two groups stumbled into each other in a narrow valley choked with pine trees and deep snow. Gunfire erupted. Corporal Kowalski was hit in the first seconds, a rifle round punching through his shoulder and spinning him into the snow. Private Tucker panicked and ran, disappearing into the trees. Brennan and the remaining 2 men, Crawford and Riley, returned fire and scrambled for cover behind a fallen log. The Germans had them outnumbered 10-1 and were moving to flank their position. Brennan knew they had minutes at best before they were surrounded and killed or captured. Crawford, firing his M1 Garand in short, controlled bursts, looked at Brennan and shouted over the gunfire, "Sir, we need to run now or we're dead." Brennan's mind raced through the options. Running meant leaving Kowalski, who was bleeding badly and could not move on his own. Standing and fighting meant certain death. Surrendering meant a POW camp, and for intelligence officers like Brennan, who had interrogated German prisoners, That often meant execution once the Germans realized what he did. There was only one other option, and it was insane. Brennan grabbed Crawford's arm. "Stop firing!" Crawford stared at him. "What?" Brennan repeated, his voice calm despite the chaos. "Stop firing, both of you, now!" Crawford and Riley exchanged glances, but they obeyed, lowering their weapons. The sudden silence was deafening. The Germans, confused by the cessation of return fire, also stopped shooting. In the ringing quiet, Brennan could hear German voices shouting questions, officers trying to assess the situation. He stood up slowly, hands empty and visible, and stepped out from behind the log. Immediately, a dozen German rifles swung toward him. A voice shouted in German, "Hands up! Do not move!" Brennan raised his hands but did not stop walking forward. He moved with slow, deliberate steps, his face calm, his eyes scanning the German position. He could see them now, cold, tired men in field-gray uniforms and helmets, most of them young, their faces red with cold and fear. He walked until he was perhaps 30 yards from the nearest German soldier, close enough to be heard clearly, far enough that they could not immediately grab him. Then he spoke in fluent German, his voice carrying across the snow with absolute authority. "I am Captain Thomas Brennan, United States Army Intelligence. You are surrounded. American forces have this entire valley encircled. We have 2 companies of infantry in the woods to your north and south, and armor moving up from the west. You were allowed to advance this far so we could cut off your retreat. Lay down your weapons and you will be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. Resist, and you will be annihilated. You have 2 minutes to decide." It was a complete lie. There were no American companies, no armor. There was only Brennan and 2 wounded, exhausted soldiers hiding behind a log. But he delivered the lie with such calm conviction, such utter certainty, that for a moment even Crawford, listening from behind cover, half believed it himself. Brennan watched the Germans carefully. He saw the doubt flickering across their faces, saw the way their eyes darted to the trees, searching for the encircling forces he had described. They were already frightened, already exhausted from weeks of combat and retreat. The surprise of the American speaking perfect German, the authoritative tone, the specific details, 2 companies, armor from the west, all combined to create a moment of profound confusion and fear. A German officer stepped forward, a lieutenant with a thin face and wire-rimmed glasses. He looked very young, perhaps 22 years old. His voice was uncertain. "You are lying. We see no other Americans." Brennan slowly lowered his right hand and reached into his coat pocket. The Germans tensed, rifles raised. Brennan pulled out his Browning baby pistol, holding it delicately between thumb and forefinger, and then let it drop into the snow at his feet. The gesture was deliberately theatrical. The tiny pistol looked absurd in the snow, a child's toy discarded. Then Brennan spoke again, his voice colder now, harder. "I have just disarmed myself to show good faith. But look around you, Lieutenant. My men have not revealed their positions. If I am lying, if we are only a small patrol, why would I walk out here alone? Why would I disarm myself in front of 40 armed soldiers?" He paused, letting the question hang in the frozen air. "The answer is simple. Because I do not need a weapon. Because you are already defeated. Your retreat is cut off. Your position is hopeless. I am giving you the chance to survive this war, to go home to your families. Do not throw that away out of pride." The lieutenant's face was a mask of anguish and confusion. Brennan could see him struggling with the decision, weighing the possibilities. If the American was telling the truth, resistance meant death for all his men. If the American was lying, but how could he be lying? What kind of madman would walk unarmed into the middle of an enemy platoon and demand their surrender, unless he had overwhelming force behind him? The logic was inescapable, and the logic was exactly what Brennan had counted on. Human beings, when frightened and uncertain, will often believe the explanation that allows them to survive. The lieutenant lowered his rifle. He turned to his men and gave an order in a quiet, defeated voice. "Waffen niederlegen. Lay down your weapons." There was a moment of resistance, Some of the older soldiers protested, argued, refused to believe they were surrendering to a lone American with a toy pistol. But the lieutenant repeated the order, and slowly, one by one, the Germans began to comply. Rifles were laid in the snow, machine guns were set down, hands were raised. 40 men, cold and frightened and tired beyond measure, chose to believe the lie that allowed them to live. Brennan did not move until every weapon was on the ground. Then he walked forward, retrieved his Browning baby from the snow, and slipped it back into his pocket. He signaled to Crawford and Riley, who emerged from cover with their weapons trained on the Germans, their faces showing pure disbelief at what had just happened. Crawford moved among the prisoners, checking them for concealed weapons, while Riley attended to the wounded Kowalski. Brennan stood before the German lieutenant and spoke quietly in German. "You made the right choice. Your men will survive this war because of your decision today." The lieutenant said nothing. His eyes were hollow with shame. The march back to American lines took 6 hours. They moved slowly through the snow. The 40 German prisoners herded ahead of Brennan's tiny group. Twice they encountered other German patrols, but the sight of their own men being marched under guard confused them long enough for Brennan to bluff his way through, shouting in German that he was escorting prisoners to the rear for interrogation, and that they should not interfere. By the time darkness fell, they had reached the American forward positions. The sentries stared in amazement as Brennan led 40 Germans out of the forest. Major Hendricks, the same officer who had mocked Brennan's pistol months earlier, met them at the command post. He looked at the prisoners, then at Brennan, then at the tiny Browning baby visible in Brennan's coat pocket. "How?" he asked simply. Brennan shrugged, exhausted. "I told them a story they wanted to believe, sir." The incident made Brennan briefly famous within the 2nd Infantry Division. The story of the intelligence captain, who captured 40 Germans with a toy pistol, spread through the ranks, growing with each retelling. Some versions had him capturing 100 Germans. Others had him doing it at gunpoint, facing down an entire company single-handedly. The truth was less dramatic but more revealing. Brennan had understood something fundamental about human psychology under stress. People will believe what makes sense of their fear. The Germans had been cold, exhausted, and demoralized. They had been retreating for weeks, losing ground daily, watching the Wehrmacht's last offensive collapse. When Brennan appeared and told them they were surrounded, it fit their existing narrative of defeat. When he disarmed himself, it created a paradox their minds resolved by assuming he must have overwhelming support. And when their officer made the decision to surrender, the social pressure to comply did the rest. Brennan had not defeated them with firepower. He had defeated them with their own fear and his understanding of how that fear could be manipulated. But the victory, if it could be called that, came with a cost that Brennan felt acutely. In the weeks after the incident, he was assigned to interrogate some of the same German prisoners he had captured. He sat across battered wooden tables in the cold interrogation rooms of the POW processing center, asking questions about unit strength, defensive positions, morale, and he saw in their eyes the shame and confusion of men who had surrendered to a lie. The young lieutenant, whose name Brennan learned was Hans Weber, refused to speak during his interrogation. He simply stared at Brennan with hollow eyes until Brennan dismissed him. Later, Brennan learned that Weber had attempted suicide in the POW camp, slashing his wrists with a piece of broken glass. He survived, but the incident haunted Brennan. He had saved those 40 men's lives by lying to them, by manipulating their fear. But he had also broken something inside them, stolen from them the ability to believe they had fought with honor. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Brennan remained with the occupation forces in Germany for another year, continuing his work in intelligence, interrogating Nazi officials and SS officers, helping to process the millions of displaced persons and prisoners that flooded across a devastated continent. He was promoted to major and received a Bronze Star for his actions in the Ardennes, though the citation made no specific mention of the incident with the 40 Germans. When he finally returned to the United States in the summer of 1946, he was 29 years old, hollow-eyed and 20 pounds lighter than when he had left. He returned to Philadelphia and tried to resume civilian life. The Army offered him a position in military intelligence, but he declined. He had seen enough of war, enough of manipulating men's fears for strategic advantage. Instead, he took a job with the Philadelphia Police Department, following his father into law enforcement. Patrick Brennan, now retired and in failing health, welcomed his son home, but immediately recognized the weight his son carried. Thomas rarely spoke about the war. He worked long hours, buried himself in casework, and became known as an exceptionally skilled interrogator. But his colleagues noticed that he never carried a gun on duty. He kept his detective's badge and a small notebook, nothing more. When asked about it, he would say simply that he had learned during the war that the most effective weapon was not the one that killed, but the one that made killing unnecessary. He married in 1948 a schoolteacher named Margaret O'Brien, who was patient with his silences and his nightmares. They had 2 children, a daughter born in 1950 and a son in 1953. Thomas was a devoted but distant father, present physically but often lost in his own thoughts. Margaret understood as much as any civilian could that part of her husband had never truly come home from Europe. He had moments of warmth and connection, but they were islands in a sea of quiet introspection. He never spoke to his children about the war. When his son asked him once if he had killed anyone, Thomas looked at him for a long moment and said, "I did many things during the war that I am not proud of, but I tried to do them in a way that left as few people dead as possible. That is all I can tell you." In 1967, Thomas Brennan retired from the police force at the age of 51. His health was declining. A lifetime of smoking and the stress of police work had damaged his heart. He spent his final years in quiet retirement, tending a small garden behind his row house in South Philadelphia, reading extensively, and occasionally meeting with other veterans from the 2nd Infantry Division. At these gatherings, the men would drink and reminisce, and sometimes someone would bring up the story of Mad Tom and his toy pistol and the 40 Germans. Brennan would smile faintly, but never elaborate on the story. Once, after several drinks, a fellow veteran asked him directly, "Tom, did you ever regret what you did that day? Did you ever think you should have just fought it out?" Brennan considered the question carefully. "I saved 5 American lives that day, including my own, and I saved 40 German lives, whether they wanted to be saved or not. But I also took something from those men that they can never get back. I took their ability to believe they surrendered with honor. So yes, I regret it. And no, I would not change it. That is what war is, living with contradictions that cannot be resolved." Thomas Brennan died in January 1972, at the age of 55, of a heart attack. He was buried with full military honors in a cemetery in Philadelphia, his bronze star and his service ribbons displayed on his coffin. The Browning baby pistol, the toy that had become briefly famous, had been lost decades earlier, probably left behind in some forgotten corner of post-war Germany. His family knew little of his wartime exploits. His children inherited a box of medals, some photographs, and a deep sense that their father had carried a burden they could never fully understand. The story of Thomas Brennan has largely faded from the historical record. There are brief mentions in divisional histories of the 2nd Infantry Division, occasional footnotes in books about the Battle of the Bulge, but nothing comprehensive. He was not a conventional hero. He fired no dramatic shots, led no charges, won no desperate firefights. What he did was quieter and, in its way, more disturbing. He understood that war is fought not just with weapons but with fear, with psychology, with the ability to make another human being believe that their only option is surrender. His tiny pistol, mocked by his peers as inadequate and absurd, became a symbol of something more complex, that sometimes the appearance of weakness, properly wielded, can be more powerful than strength, and that the most decisive victories are won not by killing the enemy, but by convincing him he has already lost. But there is a darker truth beneath that symbol. Brennan's victory was built on deception, on exploiting the fear and exhaustion of men who were, in the end, not so different from him. They were cold, tired, and far from home, fighting for a cause that was already collapsing. And they made the choice to believe a lie because the alternative was to die in the snow for nothing. Brennan gave them that choice, and in doing so, he saved lives. But he also carried the weight of that deception for the rest of his life, knowing that he had manipulated men at their most vulnerable, knowing that the shame and confusion he saw in Hans Weber's eyes was a wound that might never heal. War makes monsters of us all in different ways. Some kill, some command others to kill. Some, like Thomas Brennan, win their battles by breaking the enemy's will rather than their body. History remembers the generals and the medal winners, the dramatic last stands, and the heroic charges. It forgets the intelligence officers who fought with words and psychology, the men who understood that the human mind can be as much a battlefield as any blood-soaked ridge. Thomas Brennan was one of those men. He fought his war with a toy pistol and a gift for reading fear, and he won a victory that saved dozens of lives and haunted him until his death. The numbers in our history books, the divisions committed, the casualties sustained, the miles of territory gained or lost, are abstractions that obscure the human reality beneath. Behind every number is a person who was cold, frightened, in pain, making impossible choices with incomplete information. Behind every surrender is a moment of calculation, a weighing of honor against survival, of duty against despair. Thomas Brennan understood this in his bones. He used that understanding to bring 40 men home alive on both sides of the line. Whether that makes him a hero or something else entirely is not for us to decide. But his story, like all stories of individual soldiers in the vast machine of war, deserves to be remembered. Not because it is glorious, but because it is true. And because truth is the only honest memorial we can offer to those who survived and those who did not. If this story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe for more forgotten heroes of World War II, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if someone in your family served in any war, their stories deserve to be remembered too.